Thank you. Hello, I'm Morris Chalik, and I'm honored today to introduce Russell Misheloff and Lon Rosenman, who are going to speak to us about hearing loss. And I have to take something off my screen. There, it's fine. I have heard and seen Russell Misheloff before at times when he didn't know I saw him because he didn't know me and I was in the audience. He is president of the executive board of the DC chapter of Hearing Loss Association of America and is also in the office of Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing of the District of Columbia. He had an ear infection as a child and was treated with radium and X-ray. And many years later, as an adult, he suffered from hearing loss, then had a cochlear implant and had rehabilitation at Gallaudet. He has a BA in economics from the University of Michigan, a master's in international relationship from University of Pennsylvania, and he was in the first group of Peace Corps volunteers to Ethiopia, then spent 31 years working for the USAID and 14 years for the International Resources Group. I'm also happy to introduce you to Lon Rosenman, who is an advocacy coordinator for the Hearing Loss Association of America, DC chapter. He, as far as what I read, incurred hearing loss after an infection, an ear infection, on return from a trip to Geneva. I guess if you're going somewhere, Geneva is a good place to go to, but a shame to have hearing loss when you come back. He was eventually treated by an ENT doctor here and was given hearing aids. His degree is in math and engineering, and that's been useful in examining and evaluating assisted listening devices. He has sought to improve the accessibility of public and private facilities for hearing devices. He advocates for policy change in city, federal, and commercial organizations for the installation of assistive listening devices. And now I happily present the two gentlemen, Russell Misheloff and Harold Rosenman.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. And let me share my screen. And here we go. Okay, thank you. Just one correction, to the introduction. Morris indicated I was the president of the DC chapter, the Hearing Loss Association of America. That was true until last week. We have recently held an election, and inauguration day, if you will, was just last week. And so I am now the former president. Both Lon and I, however, do remain on the chapter's executive board. So we're still very much aware and following and involved, in the direction of the chapter. Okay, let's see if I can move that on. Let's see, to move it on forward, I clicked yes, of course. Just by way of introduction, for those of you who may not know about the Hearing Loss Association of America, it's a national organization. It's headquartered in Rockville, and it's comprised of about 130 local chapters, of which the DC area chapter is one. We like to think it's one of the better ones, if not the best. The mission of the association is to open the world of communication to people with hearing loss through provision of information, education, advocacy services, and support. Typically, our audience are people with hearing loss, but not people who identify as deaf with a capital D, part of the deaf community. These are people who, for the most part, remain in the wider hearing world and attempt with the use of technology and good communication strategies to continue functioning and thriving in the wider hearing world. What are we here to talk about? I want to talk about a lot of things, that people with hearing loss and those who support people with hearing loss, I think should know about. First of all, the signs and impacts of hearing loss. They're not always obvious to the audience and even to the people who are actually experiencing it. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll also talk about, the strategies, communication strategies and devices, hearing aids and other devices that have proven to be useful for people with varying degrees of hearing loss. We'll talk about tips for use in the home and for common social situations. We will certainly stress on the need for self-advocacy because hearing loss is invisible. I think there's a lot of things that people can do to help you. And for the most part, we find that people are quite willing, to be helpful. They don't always know how. And they don't even know, looking at you because there's no obvious signs of a disability. Unless you tell them, they don't know that you need any special assistance. And we'll talk a little bit about resources, for people with hearing loss. And certainly we at the Hearing Loss Association of America, the DC chapter, are one such resource, but there are others as well. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are regulations and guidance, that both public and private and non-governmental facilities need to be aware of and to comply with. Who has hearing loss? The answer, in short, is probably a larger number of people than you would imagine. The number of 48 million here is, first of all, an estimate, of course, because no one's ever really taken a census. And it would be difficult to take a census because a lot of people with hearing loss either, and I think this was sort of implied with what I said a moment ago, either don't recognize they have a problem or don't wish to talk in public about it. So the number is an estimate, which is based both upon self-identification, but supplemented by, some testing, which is designed, basically to include people, who are not yet willing, not yet ready, to tell the world that they've got an issue. You will see that from the percentages here, it goes up with age. That notwithstanding, about half the people, even a little more than half the people are of an age which we usually think of as non-retired in the workforce or in the student population. About 24 million of the 48 million. The 48 million, I should also point, I've given you the source of that information, because there are various estimates, and I think this is one of the better ones. That said, the estimate was made about 10 years ago. Population has increased. The presumption, I think, is that the proportion of people is about the same as it was 10 years ago. So the number 48 million is probably an underestimate. We're probably talking more like 55 to 60 million people. I should also say that not only does the percentage of people go up with advancing age, but the severity of the hearing loss they typically encounter becomes more severe with advancing age. So for the most part, let me go back a bit. the majority of people with hearing loss, it is due to problems with the cochlea in the inner ear. The deterioration of the hair cells, which comes with noise, which comes with advancing age, and a variety of other causes as well, including a variety of medications and treatments. But over the course of time, because of the nature of the hearing loss, you'll get greater numbers of people who encounter it, and you'll get greater severity of the people who do have the hearing loss. So we'll talk a little bit about these things also as we go along. Let's see, why is this not advancing? That will do it. Okay. There are a number of misconceptions about hearing loss. There is a misconception that say that it is like aging and therefore can't be helped. That was probably true at one point. It is not true today with the advance of the technology, the devices that can be used, to ameliorate the problems of hearing loss. And, our recognition that there are good communication strategies that can be very, very helpful. There are some varieties of hearing loss also that can be treated medically or surgically. And as I indicated before, it is not just a problem for the elderly, although I think that's commonly the perception. Over half the people are younger than 65. And the perception, this is also unfortunately the case, the perception that we're not either very bright or very nice. And that relates to the fact that sometimes we misunderstand. We either don't respond, to questions or comments, or respond in a way that doesn't have much to do with the question or the comment that was made. And that's just basically a reflection of the fact none of our personalities, some of us I think are very nice. I'm not sure we're better or worse than the average individual, but I think that is a problem, and we are sometimes misperceived to be nasty because we don't respond in the way that we really accept. Let me go back just one other thing. I know there's going to be questions, and we've asked people to hold the questions until we finish the session. However, if you wish, you can put questions in the chat box as they occur to you. And that way, I don't have to go back at the end and recall what it was, that you were thinking. Some more misconceptions. Everyone with hearing loss uses sign language. I can't tell you the number of times, particularly for public events, where I have told the sponsors, the organizers of the event that I have a hearing problem and the response typically is, very often is, no problem, we'll give you an interpreter, a sign language interpreter. Well, that's nice. The problem, however, is I don't use sign language. And for that matter, the vast majority of people with hearing loss don't. Most of us with hearing loss, not all, but most, developed it after we learned language and became accustomed, to communicating orally, as most people do. For me to learn sign language at this point would involve learning a foreign language, which it is. At least to me, it's a foreign language. And not only that, but I would need to either give up my present associations with friends, with family, none of whom use sign language. I do know a few people who do, but I'm not sure I even know anyone who uses American Sign Language as their preferred means of communication. They're generally people that I know are people who acquired it later for a variety of reasons. There is the conception that the best way to deal with people who have hearing loss is to shout. And really, as the name of this book, Shouting Won't Help, Why I and 50 Million Other Americans Can't Hear You by Catherine Belton. It doesn't help. What it does is basically, yes, of course, it makes everything louder, but it doesn't make things clearer. And typically it distorts your face in a fashion that, it becomes very, very hard to read you if you're talking, too loud. The book, incidentally, I do recommend. It not only gives you a lot of good information about hearing loss, but it's also entertaining. So it's one of those few things I can recommend as both entertaining and informational. And the last misconception, well, maybe not the last, but another major misconception, hearing aids and cochlear implants restore normal hearing. Both are very useful, but they don't restore normal hearing. And we'll get into that later on, what they do and what they don't do, and how you can deal with problems that hearing aids and cochlear implants don't really resolve. But we'll get into that a little later. I think I indicated before that people sometimes don't recognize they have a problem. When it is progressive in many cases. It starts off very mild, and you may not recognize what you don't hear, largely because you don't hear it, and you don't therefore know it's there. The majority of people, as indicated here, who could use hearing aids don't have them. That's in part because of that problem, the problem of recognition and of failure to recognize that there's a problem. It's also due to denial of people who deep down know they have a problem. Why do people deny and avoid? Well, for one thing, I think we mentioned a moment ago that there is the old perception that people with hearing loss are, one, old, and two, maybe kind of nasty. It's not the kind of group that people want to necessarily be associated with. And so we have all kinds of excuses given. I don't have a problem. I hear well in some settings. And that's probably true. Most of us with hearing loss, even hearing loss, which like mine is fairly severe, can hear okay in some settings, particularly quiet, one-on-one settings, where basically we're facing the person we're talking to. That person speaks well, not too rapidly, not with an accent, doesn't mumble, doesn't speak too fast or too softly, doesn't speak with chewing gum in his or her mouth. Yeah, I can generally hear reasonably well in situations of that sort. But there are lots of situations where I can't hear very well. So there's the stigma associated with hearing loss. There's the fact that you may be able to hear well in some settings, even if you have a hearing loss. And there's also the significant problem that hearing aids are expensive. And most, but not all health insurance policies do not cover hearing aids. Some do. Mine actually does. My health insurance policy does cover them, or at least in part. I can go into that later. Medicare does not cover them at all. That's a subject, which the Hearing Loss Association with America is trying to get resolved. I, however, would not hold my breath. I think that's going to take some time before it happens. Although most people don't recognize and get treatment for hearing loss earlier, at an early stage. On average, I think it's been estimated that between your initial recognition of having a hearing loss and the time that you actually seek some help with it is about 7 years. That's common. And that's why, if you go back to the last slide, one of the reasons why it says somewhere between 15 and 30% of, only 15 to 30% of people with hearing loss actually are getting treatment. That's one of the reasons. But all that said, delaying is really a bad idea. Good studies have linked untreated hearing loss to withdrawal from social relations, resulting in isolation, loneliness. There's also the association between hearing loss and falls. Basically, the cochlea, the parts of the inner ear that deal with balance are very, very close physically together. Fatigue. Hearing loss is fatiguing. Listening becomes a major exercise. So failure to treat it, can relate to fatigue. It can relate to stress. It can relate to anxiety, depression, and even dementia. There are also other hearing health issues, including diabetes and cochlear vascular disease, which, for reasons I don't think we have a good handle on, have been related, statistically, to hearing loss. Again, why is hearing loss, why is your early recognition and treatment a good thing, even though most people don't do it? Even mild hearing loss, which is hearing loss which you might not even recognize, statistically will double the risk of eventual development of dementia. With moderate hearing loss, it triples. With severe hearing loss, like mine, it increases by a factor of 5. I like to believe I'm not demented. I hope I don't become demented, but realistically, I do need to recognize that the risk is there. I have, however, treated the hearing loss. I've looked for help and I have help. I use a hearing aid in my left ear where my hearing loss is severe. I use a cochlear implant in my right ear where basically without aid, I basically hear virtually nothing. I put the source of this studies up here, and I put some of the source also. It talks about the relation between hearing loss and hearing health care and some other both quality of life and health outcomes, health consequences, or health associations with untreated hearing loss. How do you know if somebody has a hearing loss? Well, they'll be, some of them are obvious. Yes, people will ask you to repeat and to rephrase what you say. Some people will, some people won't. They just stay quiet. Hearing in groups is especially difficult because even in small groups, 4 to 6 people, you typically have multiple conversations going on at once. One of the difficulties with hearing aids and cochlear implants is that they make things louder. The problem, however, is sometimes they make both what you want to hear louder, and they also make what you don't want to hear louder. And differentiating between the two is not easy, and it's especially difficult, for people who have hearing loss. If you think other people mumble, sometimes we say that's an excuse for not admitting that it's your problem. Yes, it is true, however, that some people do mumble. If you fail to hear people speaking from behind you, that's a problem. A lot of people with hearing loss, myself included, have difficulty, even when they hear sounds, have difficulty determining where it's coming from. My wife worries about me out on the street. when she and I walk together, as we have been doing, regularly now, particularly with the pandemic having closed our health club, typically I will, particularly if it's a fairly narrow sidewalk, I will walk in front of her because she will recognize if there are people coming up from behind, running, riding a bicycle, or just walking faster than we are. I probably wouldn't recognize it because I don't hear very well, and I can't identify sounds as necessarily meaning someone coming from behind. Turning up volume on a TV or radio. There are a variety of things that I think, dreading going to noisy parties and restaurants, because noise makes communication, particularly for people with hearing loss, both difficult and, as we mentioned before, fatiguing. And lastly, and very important, you recognize hearing loss because your wife or husband thinks you have it. Typically, spouses recognize it first because you're not responding or, to something that they say, which they sort of recognize you should be able to respond to. You may not be yet even aware of the problem. Having said all this, I do want to say, just parenthetically say that some of the problems are real. There are people who speak too softly. There are people who speak rapidly with an accent. They talk with food in their mouth or gum in their mouth. Their mouth is hidden by a beard or mustache, well, like mine, I guess. And most recently, they speak behind a mask. The pandemic has been very, very difficult. Well, it's been difficult for everybody, of course. In terms of communications, I think it's especially difficulty with people, with hearing loss, because we don't see their lips. We don't see their face. We not only can't read their lips, we can't tell very much from their face about their mood. Are they joking? Are they serious? What is it that's on their mind as they talk? There are also problems with the environment, distance from the source of the sound. Loudness and clarity of speech fades rapidly as it travels over distance. Noise. For optimum hearing, speech should be at least 20 to 25 decibels louder than any competing noise. Typically, people with normal hearing don't require that, that's called basically the signal to noise ratio. People with normal hearing don't really require that. 8 to 10 decibels louder is probably enough for them to differentiate between what they want to hear and what is noise. For people with hearing loss, that doesn't work. They need more. And then, of course, there are poor acoustics, reverberations and echoes. And actually, echoes are reverberations. That is not really two different things. It's really one thing. Okay, you've got a hearing loss, you're going to take charge. You're going to do something about it. Who do you see? Well, you can go to a professional, an otolaryngologist. After years of trying to learn how to pronounce that, I still stumble over it. But basically, we're talking about an ear, nose, and throat doctor. They can rule out that there's a medical condition, a virus or another medically treatable condition that lies behind your hearing loss. Most people, however, when they seek help, they usually go to an audiologist or a hearing aid specialist. And there they'll get an evaluation. And that may result in the choice of a hearing aid, getting advice on technology and communication strategies, and on rehabilitation. I put down, a source, which I think is pretty good when treating a hearing, getting a hearing aid. Look at these two sources, I think are actually both quite good. Can you skip the step? Can you get a hearing aid without going to an audiologist or a hearing aid specialist? The answer currently is no. You can get a device, which are sold, in drugstores or in other stores, which are typically as a class referred to as personal hearing hearing devices. They're not, however, recognized as hearing aids, even though some people with hearing loss will buy them. They were really developed for, situations like particularly hunters who want to have a special, be able to hear, a very, very soft sounds in the forest, things of that sort. The Federal Drug Administration is, however, now developing regulations for over-the-counter hearing, for the introduction of over-the-counter hearing loss, which are basically going to be designed for people whose hearing loss is mild or moderate. I would not do it. I need much more help than an over-the-counter hearing loss that you'll be able to buy in the drugstore. Now the question becomes, yes, it will be possible to skip the step of going to an audiologist when the FDA declares, and develops the regulations for over-the-counter hearing aids. Then it comes the question is, should you skip that step? Well, as you say, you can get a personal amplification product or an over-the-counter here. You'll be able to get an over-the-counter hearing aid. PSAPs are like hearing aids in some ways, but they're not regulated, and therefore the quality varies, and it's very hard to tell. They cannot legally be sold for treating hearing loss, although I've seen lots of written advertisements which strongly suggest that that's what they're being sold for. They are generally not programmed for each individual user. And you can get the problem, because they're not regulated, with over amplification, making things too loud, which can result in further deterioration in your hearing. The last thing, which I didn't mention here, is for the most part, PSAPs are not programmable for the individual. So that if your hearing changes over time, there's really nothing much they can do other than buy a new one. But the major problem, I think, is they're not regulated, the quality varies, and they're really not designed to be sold, for purposes of hearing aids. The over-the-counter hearing aids, when they become available, you'll be able to buy them without going to an audiologist. That may be fine for people with mild, possibly even moderate hearing loss. With severe hearing loss, that's just fine. It's not something that why don't I turn this over? I've been talking enough. Let me turn it over.
Okay. Are we picking up over here? Hearing screening. There are a series of tests that we'll go over that are given by any audiologist. A general definition of hearing screening is a test to determine how much you can hear and how loud, first of all, how loud it has to be for you to hear it. And after you hear it, what can you understand of what you already heard? This is done for the first part of this on a frequency by frequency basis. That is, you can hear high sounds, middle sounds, low sounds, and your hearing loss is generally different across the frequency band. So people may lose a small portion of their hearing and frequency. And believe it or not, your ears are really set up so that they will try, if not to repair themselves, to struggle to catch what you say by doing what's called recruiting. If a certain band in your hearing is lost, the adjacent band, if it's still functioning better than the area which is suffering from the loss, will pick up as much of this as they possibly can. Now, if you pass the first test, you can hear the frequencies and the loudness, not a word, but just you can you can hear fairly well, there's nothing more that you really have to do. If you fail, you certainly need to determine what the nature of that loss is. Most commonly, you're tested in a room, which is a quiet room, to find the quietest sound through a pair of hearing stereophonic aids. And the audiologist will turn up the sound to see where you begin to hear on which pitches, which correspond to the frequencies. The earphones let the sounds go to, to one ear at a time, so both ears are tested independently. But having done that, you really still have to determine how much of what you hear you can understand. It is very possible, as many people know, to hear a distant sound without knowing what that distant sound is trying to convey in terms of meaning. Generally, let's have the next one. Generally, you can have your hearing screening done in a number of places. First of all, a number of health fairs will come with the equipment that will enable them to test your hearing in a quiet space. Some places like Lions Club will actually use a trailer and they'll soundproof the trailer in the interior. Health fairs generally have these online. ARP has, there are a number of online tests. ARP has recently introduced one. You can go to ARP and have your hearing tested. You can do it yourself. Costco does it fairly ubiquitously, and they will do it for nothing. CVS has a few hearing centers, and there are many others which are coming up. But still, we're behind other countries where you'll see signs out in front of almost all drugstores saying hearing tests given here. But we're catching up quickly. We're making the tests more sophisticated, and we're making an understanding of what your hearing loss is known to those who are actually experiencing it. Next. The audiologist, however, does more, has to do more, I should say, than a series of tests. They have to know what particular challenges you have, what your hopes and fears are as far as what you expect to get out of a pair of hearing aids, cochlear implants, or other devices that you use to remedy your hearing loss. If you have or suspect a medical problem, your audiologist should also be told about this. Next, Russ. One of the things you're going to want to really hone in on is what difficulties you have in the environment within which you live, your general home environment. Do you have problems with general conversation? If you do have problems with general conversation, are they, to your knowledge, because others are trying to talk to you from another room, or is it because you can't participate in the conversation because there are too many people talking? Do you require TV volume to be so high to understand what's coming across that it's disturbing others? Are children's voices, and this is not uncommon, more difficult to understand? Telephone conversations, can you pick up a telephone and understand what's being said, even if you can increase the volume on the telephone? There are remedies which can help considerably in facing all these problems, and we'll talk about that next. But one or two problems we should call out right here: social activities, and a lot of people don't like to admit that they go to a family gathering, but the reason they hold back and don't participate is what Russ said earlier. You're getting everybody trying to talk at once, and everybody trying to talk loudly enough so that they can be heard over the conversation going on next to them. And sometimes your choice of personal appearance enters into what we'll soon see are the choice of your hearing aids. Some people don't want to be seen with a bulky hearing aid, which is apparent outside the ear. They want something which is what's known as completely in the canal and almost disappears when you're wearing them. But there are difficulties in that respect that we'll also get to when we talk about the capabilities of the hearing aids which you're going to purchase, acquire. Next.
Let me just make one further point on this. I've heard people compare, the idea that, if you have a problem, you go to the audiologist, fine. It's not, however, like getting your eyes examined. You need to have some, in the case, hearing is a lot more complicated. You need to have some idea, provide information about what kinds of problems you're having and the situations in order, for a professional, to be of a lot of help. That's important.
Right, that's coming up. The work situation is one in which people participate. I shouldn't just say work. There are things you can belong to a club, you can participate in professional conferences, but you have to make known if that is an area in which you find particular difficulties. An occupation-related needs are also very important. Musicians and one of the board members of the national group that HLAA has nearby in Rockville is a conductor and a composer. He listens to a lot of music. He may be semi-retired, but he still participates in a lot of activities. This calls upon specific needs. For instance, he may need to have clearer high notes, and that may be because his instrument emphasizes the high notes. He may need a spectrum of hearing frequencies improved, which are, unique to his particular profession. In addition to that, people who give talks, such as Russ and myself, if we are in a presentation in front of people, that has to be known, because we have to be able to zero in on what some people in back of the audience are trying to say. Now, there are technical solutions which can assist in this particular need, but people don't always abide by the rules, and your audiologist really has to know which of these situations which are giving you difficulty are most common to your needs. Next, Russ. So the hearing evaluation testing is actually going to test a number of different things. And this is testing which will be done in conjunction with knowing what your needs are. Air conduction is the most common. Air conduction simply means that the cilia, which are in your ears, wave according to the way the atmosphere, the wind, any noise or sound, vibration actually has them moving. Air conduction moves the cilia in your ears, and depending on which cilia or hairs are moving, different frequencies are generated. That different frequency results in a minuscule electrical signal which goes down, is transmitted to your brain. And that is particularly how most people hear. 80% of hearing aid, which is a hearing loss, which is called sensorineural hearing, is for the loss due to inability to have full or normal air conduction. After air conduction, there is the bone conduction, because the inner ear can be bypassed with a cochlear implant, either to stimulate the nerves underneath with some sort of a signal, an electrical signal, or lacking that, something called BAHA, B-A-H-A, allows you to conduct sound directly to the bone, which can be understood in the same manner, because after the bone picks up the signal, after the bone does it, the signal, the vibration is actually transmitted to the same part of the brain that's responsible for understanding speech, which is conducted in other ways. We have to know how you discriminate, adjusting frequency and loudness. You remember before, I mentioned very quickly that there is recruitment. Recruitment meaning where there's a dead spot in the cilia and certain frequencies aren't being transmitted correctly, the sound can still be picked up by the adjacent cilia. So if your hearing aids can shift the frequency from what is being said at frequency A to a slight offset in frequency B, you can still hear that with your ears. Maybe a little deeper, maybe a little higher frequency, but you can still hear. These are things your audiologist has to know in order to know what to prescribe, what sort of hearing aids you need, and which ones will give you the most natural hearing possible for your particular loss. Threshold, comfort, discomfort, yes, measures the range, soft to loud, of what you're comfortable hearing. And impedance, if there's an electrical engineer or electrician out there, they know that's resistance to passing on a signal. Here it's resistance to passing on sound through the eardrum. Have the next. Hearing loss is arbitrarily divided into bands, arbitrarily the frequencies that you can hear. Normal hearing, people can generally hear water dripping or a bird chirping if they're close enough to hear it. Mild hearing is a loss where only, as this particular slide illustrates, you can hear a clock with a noticeable tick-tock. Moderate hearing loss, people have to speak with a slightly elevated voice for you to be comfortable. Severe hearing loss is where you really do depend on your hearing aids. There's no doubt about it. And you won't hear anything in a manner which allows you to determine what it is that's being said or where it's coming from if you have a severe hearing loss. Profound hearing, profound is used generally to describe those who are essentially deaf. You can still pick up vibrations, you can still get some bone conduction, you can still be aware of sound around you, but this is generally a state of being unable to hear, even with hearing aids. Next, Russ. And what you get after all of these tests is an audiogram. What an audiogram does is diagram where your hearing loss is in the frequency ranges in your left and right ears. An audiogram is a good thing for you to ask for if it's not given to you, because if you have the audiogram and you decide that the audiologist you're going to is not the audiogram, is not the audiologist that you want, if for one reason or another you're not comfortable with that audiologist, or you figure that the audiologist is not providing you with the solutions that you require, you can pick up your audiogram and go to another audiologist and ask them as a first stage what they would do with somebody with that sort of a hearing loss. in addition to that, your audiologist after the tests may determine that really you need, as Russ was saying, an otolaryngologist, that's an ENT, or other medical specialist. And that should be the first order of correcting your hearing loss. First seeing the medical doctor if they are needed, and then going back to the audiologist with those needs. Next. Well, hearing aids are a complex thing today. Hearing aids used to be just like a radio. You dialed up the volume and that was it. As I said, there are frequencies today that can be tuned individually. There are bands which can be treated individually, making them higher or lower depending upon your particular needs. The hearing aids are really very sophisticated devices. In fact, what they are miniature computers. They have programs in them. The programs that are in any given hearing aid today are multiple hearing aids which are tuned to respond to the needs in various environments, your home environment, a street environment, a restaurant environment, listening to music, and so on. And they also treat telephone communication. And there are hearing aids, and this is where I'm going to jump ahead of myself a little bit, that depend on smartphones. Some of them depend on wholly external devices, such as we'll talk about later, called a hearing loop. Some of them can connect directly to sound sources, and they can do that either through the smartphone or through a streaming device. Hearing aid brands and models include different capabilities. They include different accessories. The accessories will help you determine which of the hearing aid brands are right for you, because which of these accessories meet your needs in the different environments in which you have identified as being essential to your day-to-day living, whether or not, for instance, working, let's say you work in a supermarket and it's a noisy environment all around. Can I control the background noise? Let's say you're a musician, we've already talked about that, but there are a whole host of different environments which you have to consider, and consider what extensions to your hearing aid. And that today, we'll talk about extensions in a little bit, and I'll define it a little more closely. Next, Russ. We said assessing your needs, we've already been over that. And most of the time, especially if you're buying them for the first time, you're going to need time to adjust to them. That's for your brain. A new hearing aid is like an accent. You have to get used to it. You must adjust to the differences between what you're hearing through an electronic device and what you've heard. So generally, most states, I think today all states, when we first wrote this, we were saying usually. I think now I know of no place in the US anyway where you don't get a trial period. And within a 30-day period, you can walk into the audiologist's office, hand them back, and say, I'd like to try another. You find a huge difference in the sound of hearing aids from one brand to another. And as a matter of fact, if you do try multiples, you may decide the first ones you tried and returned are actually the preferable ones. You may find the second or the third, but you not only have this adjustment period to get used to the hearing aids, but you may, as your hearing changes, and it probably will change over an extended period of time, You may have to periodically reassess your hearing, your particular needs, and the particular capabilities of the hearing aid itself and amplifying different frequencies. Next. Next, yes. In addition to what I was just talking about, also think of your personal involvement. For instance, some hearing aids still use small batteries rather than being rechargeable. If they take opening up a little compartment in the case, changing the battery, closing it up, people with arthritis can have a tremendously difficult time opening these, closing these, getting them right. Agility is a big question. At one point in time, your ability to hold a steady hand, your vision and being able to identify the small component inside, which says which way the battery goes, may be compromised. The use of smartphones is today much more extensive. Smartphones really are much more like an extension of the hearing aids themselves. It's just that with a hearing aid, something I should have mentioned before, I think will come up, what you can have in the hearing aid itself is dependent upon the size of the hearing aid. Maybe you want something completely in the ear, a CIC, completely in the canal or in the ear canal phone. And they can pack today enough miniature components in there to give you great hearing or good hearing and maybe one or two options. But if you get a small hearing aid, you may not be able to include some of the options which you find necessary to living in an environment that you're used to. The smartphone, in addition to that, has some really great, great programs in it. It can provide a much wider range of environmental programs, which you can go with right out of the box, or which you can adjust as far as the high, middle, and low frequencies are concerned. And a lot of new aids are depending more and more on that. They're also depending on the smartphone to transmit, called streaming, of sounds which are generated by telephones or other devices which you want to support your environment. These are a real blessing in one way, because the sound from a telephone, from a smartphone, is directly in the ear. The closer to the eardrum you get, the clearer the sound is, the easier it is for you to make intelligible and to understand. Well, there is a drawback. I mean, if I don't carry the smartphone with me, if I forget it in another room, and the phone starts to ring, it'll ring in my ear and I have no idea where the smartphone is. I can't locate it by saying, aha, I hear the phone in another room. I can get up and just follow the noise. It's at the same volume, no matter where in the house I am. So I'll depend on somebody else, like my wife, who's saying, what room does it sound like it's coming from? But again, it makes you more dependent on the smartphone, but that dependency, in my mind, is very frequently well worth carrying it around with you most of the time. And of course, as I already said, what sounds best to you? What are you most comfortable with? Is the sound? What accessories are available? Accessories, and there are streaming accessories like a microphone, which you can hand to somebody else who's in the room but far enough away from you so you're not comfortable listening to him. You can get streaming devices that hook directly onto your television and which make listening to the television much easier, especially if you get up, if you feel you want a snack, you go down, you can still listen to the television as you walk away from the actual television set. Next for us. But all of these options which I'm talking about, all of these extensions which I'm describing are making hearing aids expensive. The good news is that with more manufacturers entering the marketplace and with many laboratories more coming up with additional improvements to hearing aids, they are coming down in price. About 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, I would have paid $7,200 for a pair of hearing aids, which I had. An equivalent price on the market price for hearing aids that give me more today is about $4,800. That's $2,600 difference. And it's coming down and probably will continue to come down in the future as more devices are manufactured by manufacturers who were never in this marketplace before. Notable, just to give you an example, is Bose, who have for years and years done speaker systems for stereo systems. Today, Bose is looking at manufacturing devices for those with hearing loss, manufacturing devices for televisions, which use, if you want, hearing aid technology to make listening through speakers much easier. In addition to that, the hearing aids are, as I said, expensive because the accessories that they have, the technical sophistication, which really has been dependent on miniaturization and much more expensive components. So we have more and more of this, but you still have to be willing, I think, to put out some good monies for really quality hearing aids.
Just one minute, I'd like to ask Morris if we would, how much time we have, because I do want to leave some time, for people who have questions.
I'm not sure what to say to you, whether it might be better for me to ask Jonas. Jonas, are you on with us?
Yeah, how many more slides do you have?
Well,
I think we could finish up
or I think,
in about 10 slides.
Okay, you have it again. You have as much time as you need, but I would encourage you to wrap up by like 4:15 at the latest. If that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
So we can have time for some questions.
Yeah, that's fine. Can do that.
Thanks, Jonas.
Yeah. And we're going to talk now what hearing aids will not do. Russ mentioned noisy environment. We've referred to family gatherings and rooms which have echoes in them. Hard surfaces aren't actually designed to muffle sounds that are bouncing around a dining hall, for instance. A restaurant is the absolute prototypical difficult place to listen for sound in. And there's nothing you can do about that, really. You can't solve that problem. You can provide everybody with microphones, that's clumsy. But a hearing aid will not actually solve these problems. Next, Ruff. Hearing assistive technology, loads of things that we can do and we can work with, but again, some of them are more expensive than others. A loop, a room loop or a neck loop is really nothing more than a wire that goes around a place. It can be in a medical facility, in a waiting room. It can be in a restaurant. If the restaurants, some restaurants in New York have looped certain areas. It can be in a concert hall. This is a wire that goes around a given area where those who have hearing loss, if they indicate they have hearing loss and need it, can be seated. What happens is that anybody speaking to them over a cordless mic or from outside on the stage, if the actors are wired for sound, will transmit it to this area which has the wire surrounding it been looped in the jargon, and it will go directly to your ears and make things much clearer. So you can get this, you can get FM systems, which are much more expensive, but are also very good for this sort of thing. Next, Russ. Many devices are essential to some. I live in an apartment building. Fire alarms go off in the apartment building. Most of the time I can hear them, but there are many instances in which alarms, baby alarms, carbon monoxide alarms, which are quiet, telephone calls that come through, alarm clocks. So if I want to get up in the morning for a flight, I may not be able to use these unless there is some other means of my detecting that they are trying to tell me something. There are visual things such as strobe lights. There are tactile signals, such as alarm clocks, which shake the pillows. The telephone calls, as I've already told you, if you wear a hearing aid at night, you can have a streaming device which allows it to go directly to your ear. Doorbells can be wired to do exactly the same thing. So there are many ways, both audio, tactile, and visual as strobe lights, for signaling alarms that you may want to be made aware or may essentially need to be aware of, such as fire alarms. Next, Russ. But as we said in the beginning, you really have to speak up and advocate for yourself. Nobody is going to look at you when you walk in a restaurant and say, that person is hard of hearing. You're going to have to tell them not only that you're hard of hearing, but where in the restaurant is there a booth which has the backs of the booths upholstered, which will dampen the sound. You have to tell others, a waiter, for instance, who may turn around while speaking to you, that if he turns the back of his head to you, you're lost. You have to tell people, don't walk away from me. The average hearing aid can pick up sounds clearly at most 6 feet from the hearing aid. 4 feet or less is actually much better. Hearing the sound waves are like akin to the same effects on hearing aids that throwing a rock or a pebble into a pool of water is. You'll see the ripple, you'll see a circle around where the rock entered the water. When it just goes a few inches, a foot or two, you can clearly see the shape of that tide, of that wave which has been generated. When it goes out 8, 10, 20 feet, it disappears. It becomes almost, it faded into nothing. Same with hearing aids. Russ, next one. Next. Communication. And when you're talking to people who are not used to your hearing loss, be patient. You can tell them once and they may remember it for a few minutes, but they'll forget it. They've been talking to people normally. You look normal. They've been doing it over many years, 30, 40, 50 years. It's not going to come naturally to changing. Be prepared to repeat requests for people who, for information because you didn't have them. Ask if you have a partner who says something, you still don't get it because of a particular word, ask them to rephrase. It's much better than repeating. There are certain sounds that you really may be unable to hear clearly. And of course, if they're talking about a variety of subjects, you want to be clued in sometimes if changing the subject is going to happen frequently. If they can tap on something, tell you, point to you, tell you they're changing the subject, make you aware of it, you can essentially retune to whatever it is that they're talking about. Next.
Can we see if there are any questions at this point? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
We're at 4:15. Go ahead.
No, I think that's a good idea. There are a few more slides, but in many respects, I think they're almost self-explanatory, and we can certainly make the PowerPoint available, you know, so that people are interested in some of the things that, a few of the things that follow, you know, and I don't think we necessarily need to add very much to that. So I'll stop the sharing and we'll look at the questions. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, Burke has a question. There we go. Burke, you're going to be muted though. So
I joined about 10 minutes late, so I hope you didn't answer this well, you know, before. If it is, don't repeat it. But you you see, there's going to like doctors, hearing doctors, getting prescriptions for hearing aids, but then there's like shops you see on K Street that just says they're just a hearing aid shop that aren't part of a hearing profession. Comment on different places to go to get hearing aid, particularly if you want to move to higher tech.
Which one of us, Russ, takes this?
Go ahead. I may chime in, but go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, I'm not entirely certain. I understand the question. You can today, the only place you can get legal hearing aids is through an audiologist or a hearing aid specialist. There are some of the couple of the big box stores have set up, you know, basically hearing facilities. Cost.
No, I think all of them that I'm thinking of have audiologists. Some are connected with, you know, doctors that deal with the whole huge range of hearing problems and have many doctors, and others just seem to specialize in doing hearing aids.
If I can, Russ, first of all, you have audiologists who are in there to sell one product. You walk into an audiologist and they're selling one hearing aid, turn around, walk out, because you want to have a choice in the best hearing aid for what your particular problem is. Going to an audiologist, the first thing you have to determine is whether or not you feel compatible. You feel that the audiologist is listening to you. And you can probably do that in the first 10 minutes.
And it is true that there are some audiologists, you know, who basically will sell a single brand, and they're in many respects it's a vertical integration, you know, of the industry, where the manufacturers and the audiologists are basically part of a team. I'd steer away from that. It isn't necessarily, you know, that. Let me put it this way: there are 5 major hearing aid brands. They're all pretty good. I mean, you're not gonna. That's not so much